The auction barn was quiet at first light, the kind of silence that felt suspended, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Dust motes floated lazily in the narrow shafts of sunlight, spilling through the cracks in the weathered roof, settling on the worn wooden floors and the horses who shifted uneasily in their pens. The scent of hay, leather, and damp earth hung thick, almost tangible, pressing against the nose and throat of anyone who dared to linger too long. Ella stood at the far edge of the barn, boots scuffed and fraying at the seams, toes nudging loose straw as she watched the bustling crowd. She was 16, tall for her age, but still slight, a ribbon of a girl whose hands were calloused from years of chores, whose face carried the faint traces of sunburn and wind, the kind of face that could go unnoticed in a crowd. Her father had already disappeared somewhere deeper in the barn, speaking in low tones to the auctioneer about bills he couldn't yet pay, about feed he couldn't yet afford. Ella had learned early how to measure her worth by utility, by the ability to endure without complaint, and yet here, standing on tiptoe, she felt both invisible and exposed. Every sharp whisper of paper, every muttered bid, every clink of the auctioneer's gavel seemed to underline a truth she had known for years. The world valued what was polished, profitable, and pleasing to the eye, and she, like so many others, was easily overlooked. She followed the crowd's gaze, eyes flicking from one gleaming horse to the next. Bay Mares with muscles sculpted in sunlight, sleek geldings whose coats shone like burnished copper, tails braided for presentation, hooves clipped and polished. The buyers whispered among themselves, nodding, scribbling numbers, imagining futures of prize ribbons and high-stakes races. Ella understood the language of value here, but it was a language she had never spoken fluently. Her hands itched to touch, to feel, to understand through her own senses rather than through the judgment of others. But she kept them folded, her fingers laced in quiet patience. Then, in the far corner of the barn, away from the bright bustle, she noticed something the others seemed eager to ignore. It was small at first, a shape shrouded in shadow and dust, a creature whose coat was dull and rough, whose mane fell in uneven strands. One shoulder bore a pale scar, the memory of some injury no one had cared to mend. The horse's eyes were cautious, wary, large dark orbs that blinked slowly, measuring the room, the people, the weight of expectation. It shifted its hooves nervously, stamping once, twice, sending a fine cloud of hay into the air. The crowd bypassed it without notice, laughter and low mutters breaking across the polished horses in the center of the barn. "Ugly," someone whispered. "Hardly worth a glance." Others shook their heads in amusement, already moving on to the next bid, the next prize, the next fleeting chance to feel ownership over something deemed superior. Ella's gaze lingered. She noticed the way the horse's ears flicked toward her, how its nostrils flared at the faint scent of her approach. She felt a strange tug in her chest, a recognition of something familiar in its unease, its quiet patience, the way it had learned to wait while the world walked past. Her boots made no sound on the loose straw as she edged closer, eyes never leaving the horse's. She could see the fine tremor in its neck, the way it leaned slightly toward the wall, not wanting to be noticed but hoping, somewhere deep down, that someone might see. Her fingers itched to reach out, and when she finally did, brushing a cautious hand along its nose, the warmth startled her. The horse inhaled, slow and deliberate, its breath brushing against her palm. She held still, letting the quiet speak between them. It was not a creature for the taking, not yet. It was a presence that demanded recognition, patience, understanding. She thought of her father, haggling over numbers he could barely afford, of the cracked fence posts and empty feed bins back at the ranch. She thought of her own reflection in the barn's dusty windows, of a life measured in small sacrifices and careful compromises. And yet, in this corner of the barn, amidst shadows and dust, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, the spark of possibility. Maybe there was a place in the world for what others overlooked, for what the crowd dismissed as flawed or unworthy. The horse shifted again, ears pricked, eyes meeting hers fully now, without fear. For the first time, Ella felt the quiet, insistent pulse of understanding. It was not just the horse who was waiting. She had been waiting, too, for the recognition that she might see something the world refused to acknowledge. The thought tightened in her chest, bringing a flush of warmth that spread through her arms and legs. She felt small, yes, but not invisible. She was a witness, and witnesses carried a quiet kind of power. The auctioneer's voice rose in the distance, a faint rasping over the calls for bids she could barely follow, the numbers floating above the heads of buyers who had never noticed the corner where shadows gathered. Ella's hand lingered on the horse's nose, brushing against coarse hair, feeling the faint tremor of muscle beneath. It was a moment suspended, fragile and precise, as if the world had paused long enough to ask a question it did not yet expect to answer. She stepped back slightly, letting the horse breathe freely, but did not leave. She could not. Something in her told her that if she turned away now, she might never return to this quiet truth, this fragile connection, this spark of recognition between two beings who had learned too well the art of being unseen. Her father's distant voice rose, calling her name, but she did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained locked with the horse, and for a moment, the rest of the barn, the bids, the polished coats, the indifferent crowd, ceased to exist. A question formed, small but insistent, hanging between her and the horse. Could she protect this creature that no one wanted? Could she offer a place in the world for something, for someone, overlooked, dismissed, unseen? She did not have an answer yet, only the certainty that she could not walk away. The horse shifted again, brushing its head lightly against her hand, and she felt the first weight of responsibility settle in her chest. It was not a burden, it was a spark, and with that spark, something inside her shifted. Perhaps, she thought, the world had overlooked the horse, but she had not. Perhaps kindness, patience, and quiet courage could matter more than beauty or price. Perhaps, in the corners of dusty barns and overlooked lives, there were truths waiting for those willing to see. She exhaled slowly, feeling the cold morning air mingle with the warmth pressing from her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to act. The sun climbed higher, slicing light through the cracks in the barn roof, catching dust and hair and straw in golden threads. Somewhere deep inside, a pulse quickened, a promise formed. The question remained, would the world allow her to save what it had deemed worthless, or would she, like so many before, be forced to watch it pass by? Either way, she would not leave this corner without trying. And so, with careful steps and a steady hand, Ella remained, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips, waiting for the moment when the spark of struggle might become the first act of change. The barn had emptied somewhat by mid-morning, leaving the air quieter, tinged with the faint warmth of sun spilling through high windows. Dust motes drifted in lazy spirals, catching the light like tiny sparks, settling on beams and loose straw. Ella lingered near the far corner, the one that everyone seemed to have forgotten. The horse stood there still, ears flicking, nostrils quivering, as if it had been waiting for someone who finally mattered. She approached slowly, boots crunching softly against the hay-strewn floor, heart steady despite the flurry of doubt that had begun to settle in her chest. The first thing she noticed was the way the horse's head lifted at her approach, eyes dark and knowing, measuring her intent. It was not a naive gaze, but one seasoned by avoidance, by the long hours of being passed over, dismissed, judged. Ella extended a hand, not to claim, not to command, but to offer reassurance. The horse sniffed, then lowered its head, letting her fingers brush along the coarse mane, each strand rough but warm under her touch. The sensation was grounding, like pressing her palm against a living heartbeat. For a brief moment, the world beyond the barn, the auctioneer, the other buyers, the polished, perfect horses, vanished, leaving only the two of them, small and patient, in a quiet understanding. She knelt on the straw, allowing her weight to settle, feeling the tension in the horse's muscles relax as she exhaled slowly. The stall was faintly sweet with hay and horse sweat, a smell she had grown to recognize from years of chores back at the ranch. It carried with it memories of her father's calloused hands, the rhythmic scraping of a broom across the barn floor, the warmth of winter mornings when the cold seemed to seep into every corner. She realized that she had never felt quite this alive, this present, in any place but the corners of forgotten barns, among creatures that had no one else to see them. Her reflection on her own marginal place in the world mingled with her growing fascination with this horse. She thought of the unspoken rules that had always governed her life. Appearances mattered, wealth mattered, and those who were overlooked often stayed overlooked. Yet here was proof that being unnoticed did not mean being unworthy. The horse had survived despite neglect, had endured because it had to, because no one else would see what was beneath the surface. In its gaze, Ella glimpsed a mirror of her own quiet endurance, the small victories of a life lived with careful, measured persistence. As she straightened, brushing straw from her knees, the horse shifted, the movement sending a small puff of dust into the golden light. Its hooves scraped against the worn floor, a low, tentative sound, and she realized it was inviting her closer. She stepped forward, heart pulsing, and ran her hands along its shoulders, feeling the fine ridges of muscle beneath scarred skin. Every mark, every blemish, told a story of resilience, of survival, and of quiet dignity. She whispered to it softly, her voice low and steady, though the words were almost irrelevant. The sound was meant to convey intention, presence, and patience. A sudden noise from the main floor, the auctioneer calling another bid, made the horse flinch slightly. Its ears twitched, nostrils flaring, muscles coiling instinctively. Ella paused, letting the tension settle, speaking again in soft syllables, letting her calmness meet the creature's unease. Slowly, the horse lowered its head, brushing it lightly against her shoulder. The contact was fleeting but deliberate, a small acknowledgement of trust. A shiver of warmth ran through her, the recognition that she had become, in that instant, more than a passive observer. She was a participant in a fragile bond, one that could either strengthen or break depending on what came next. Her mind wandered briefly to her father, who would be fretting somewhere in the central aisle, calculating, worrying about dollars, about survival, about the relentless pressure of keeping the ranch afloat. She wondered what he would say if he could see her now, crouched beside this scruffy horse, eyes locked in silent dialogue. Probably he would caution practicality over sentiment. Probably he would argue that no one had ever succeeded by investing in what others deemed worthless. And yet, even imagining that argument, she felt a stubborn pulse in her chest, a quiet insistence that kindness and discernment mattered more than convention. Ella circled the horse, hand running along its flank, careful to respect its space while maintaining contact. She noticed the way its coat, dull from neglect, carried hints of the chestnut brilliance beneath the grime, the way its scars spoke not of weakness but of endurance, the way its eyes, dark and alert, held the patient wisdom of one who had learned to survive without being loved. She thought of herself, of the long mornings spent feeding, mucking stalls, repairing fences, and keeping silent about dreams she was never sure she could afford. In that moment, she realized that she understood the horse in ways others could not, because she, too, had learned to persist quietly, to exist in corners the world ignored. The auctioneer's voice rose again, a harsh rasping over the din of distant clinks and murmurs. Ella felt the stirrings of urgency. The horse could be claimed by someone who would see only its imperfections, its scars, its lack of polish. She crouched closer, pressing her palm gently against its nose, and felt the tremor of its breathing against her fingers. A decision formed, quiet but resolute. She would not walk away. She would find a way to claim what no one else valued, not out of rebellion, not out of vanity, but out of recognition and respect for the courage embedded in survival. The moment stretched, suspended in the warm, dusty light. The horse shifted, sniffed the air, and nudged her again, a faint but unmistakable gesture of trust. It was not a leap of faith. It was a measured decision, born of observation and patience, and it mirrored her own readiness to act despite uncertainty. She straightened, brushing straw from her knees, inhaling the scent of hay and horseflesh, feeling the rhythm of a life that demanded attention and care. She could almost hear the quiet voice of possibility whispering through the barn. Here is worth that the world does not see. Here is value beyond measure. Ella rose fully, hands still resting lightly on the horse's nose. She looked toward the main floor of the barn, toward the bustling auction, and realized that this small, scruffy horse had already begun to teach her something vital. Not every worth is obvious. Not every beauty is recognized. And sometimes the act of noticing, of caring, of choosing to act in the face of indifference is the truest measure of character. She exhaled slowly, feeling a tremor of anticipation, of responsibility, of hope. The question was no longer whether she would help the horse. It was how. And in that quiet, suspended morning, the barn seemed to shrink to a single corner, a single beam of golden light, a single heartbeat. The horse nuzzled her once more, and she felt the faintest pulse of connection, a fragile promise, a spark of trust. Somewhere beyond the wooden walls, the auction continued, oblivious. But in this corner, a bond had formed, subtle and precise, ready to endure whatever challenges the world might send next. Ella took a final, steadying breath, feeling the weight and the lift of responsibility, and stepped back slightly, leaving the horse space to move, yet refusing to leave it behind. The spark of possibility had been lit, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The barn felt heavier that afternoon, the air thick with dust and the low hum of distant voices. The crowd had thinned, leaving pockets of murmur and movement that seemed to echo off the wooden walls. Ella stayed near the horse, her fingers tracing the lines of its coat, noting the faded scars and uneven muscles with a careful eye. Something about the way it shifted its weight, wary but patient, told her that this creature had endured far more than most. But endurance alone would not guarantee a future. The world beyond the barn had rules, rigid and unyielding, and the first of them was that appearances determine value. Her father returned from the auction floor, frown deepening across his weathered face. He carried the ledger, a thin notebook where each line held the weight of bills, of feed orders, of fence repairs. He glanced at the horse, then at Ella, and the corners of his mouth tightened. "It's no good," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You can't afford a horse like that. Not when we're struggling to keep this place standing." His words were practical, shaped by years of hardship, yet they struck a chord in Ella that resonated beyond reason. She knew he spoke truth, but she also recognized a truth he could not see. Sometimes, value was measured not in dollars, but in possibility. Ella knelt beside the horse again, brushing her hand along its shoulder. Its muscles twitched beneath her touch, strong and tense despite the neglect, and she noticed how its scars were not blemishes but evidence of survival. Each mark told a story of endurance, of quiet resistance to indifference. She whispered softly, speaking more to herself than to the horse, trying to reconcile the practicality of her father's warnings with the instinct rising within her. She had learned, in years of quiet observation, that those who persevered quietly often held the most profound strength. This horse, with its crooked mane and wary eyes, embodied that truth. Yet the world outside the corner of the barn had little patience for subtlety. The auctioneer's voice rose intermittently, calling out numbers for horses polished and ready, animals without blemish or hesitation. Occasionally, he glanced toward the scruffy horse, a faint frown tightening his features. "Not much interest here," he muttered, shaking his head. Other ranchers leaned in, offering critiques rather than bids. "Too small," one said. "Scarred up. You'll get nothing for it." Their observations were blunt, unfeeling, and yet Ella understood them too well. This was the language of the world: profit over compassion, quick judgment over patience, and the careless dismissal of what could not be immediately quantified. Her curiosity deepened when she overheard a conversation between two of the older ranchers. "I heard it came from a neglectful owner," one said. "Had some injury years back. Couldn't make a profit, so they let it rot." The words struck her sharply. She could see the truth behind them in the horse's careful movements, in the cautious tilt of its head. But she also recognized that the story told only half the truth. Neglect and injury were not flaws. They were circumstances, accidents of fortune that had nothing to do with the creature's worth or intelligence. And yet the world treated them as if they were evidence of failure. Ella's resolve strengthened. She needed to know more about the horse's history, its resilience, and the world that had turned its back. Slipping quietly away from the pen, she approached a small desk near the auctioneer's area, where a thin stack of papers lay. Veterinary records, notes on prior ownership, dates of treatments. All dry, factual, but rich with insight for those willing to read between the lines. She pored over each one, tracing the faded ink, noting the small victories amid the neglect. The horse had been fed, watered, tended when possible. It had been exercised despite its injuries. It had survived storms, harsh winters, and indifference. Each line was a testament not to failure, but to endurance, and Ella felt a swelling of admiration and responsibility in equal measure. A clerk, noticing her interest, approached with a frown. "You shouldn't be handling those," he said. Ella looked up, meeting his gaze. She did not argue, only nodded respectfully, returning her attention to the horse, which had begun to shift uneasily in its stall. She realized that the world would not willingly hand her this knowledge. She would have to claim it herself, quietly, deliberately, with patience and persistence. There was no dramatic confrontation here, only careful observation, careful care, and the slow accumulation of understanding. Returning to the horse, Ella ran her fingers along the faint lines of healed wounds, feeling the pulse of strength beneath the scars. She whispered again, soft syllables meant to soothe, to reassure, to establish trust. The horse leaned slightly into her hand, a delicate gesture that spoke volumes. It had survived years of neglect, of indifference, and yet it had not given up. Ella felt the gravity of the choice she faced, to act, to protect, to advocate, knowing that others might see the effort as foolish, impractical, or impossible. The afternoon light shifted, falling across the barn in long, golden beams. Shadows deepened in the corners, stretching across straw and wood, across faces and hooves. Ella glanced toward the main floor, where polished horses received attention and bids, and felt the tension of contrast. Here in the corner, a small miracle of patience and endurance awaited recognition. There, the world celebrated the immediately visible, the pleasing, the profitable. She understood that the struggle was not with the horse, but with the world that refused to see beyond the surface. A faint noise at the far end of the barn, a cough, a clearing of the throat, made her turn. An older rancher, leaning on a cane, regarded her with quiet curiosity. His eyes were sharp, the wrinkles at their corners evidence of decades of observation. He said nothing at first, merely watched as she knelt beside the horse, tracing its scars with her fingertips. Finally, he spoke, voice low but steady. "You're seeing what others won't," he said. "Some lessons come only to those who refuse to give up." Ella's pulse quickened. She had known the truth of his words in her heart, but hearing them aloud gave weight, legitimacy, and courage. The horse shifted again, nudging her shoulder gently. It was a small act, but intentional, a reaffirmation of trust. Ella realized that she could not turn away, could not let practicality or fear of judgment dictate the moment. The knowledge she had uncovered, the quiet resilience of this creature, and her own awareness of hardship formed a nexus of moral responsibility. The world had overlooked the horse, had misjudged its worth, and now the choice rested with her, to claim, to protect, to honor what others had dismissed. She stood slowly, brushing straw from her knees and skirt, hand lingering briefly on the horse's nose. The golden afternoon light reflected in its eyes, revealing intelligence, patience, and a quiet, unwavering strength. Ella felt the weight of what lay ahead: opposition, doubt, risk, but also the potential for something extraordinary, something rare. She took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of resolve in her chest. The world might not value this horse, might never recognize the quiet dignity that had survived neglect, injury, and indifference. But she did. And that recognition was the beginning of everything. As the barn doors creaked in the late afternoon breeze, casting long shadows across the pens and aisles, Ella realized that she had crossed an invisible threshold. She had moved from observer to advocate, from witness to participant in the life of a creature overlooked. The choice she had quietly made, to act, to care, to insist upon the horse's worth, was the first step in a journey that would demand courage, patience, and steadfast moral clarity. Somewhere beyond the golden shafts of light, the world continued, indifferent and bustling. But here, in the corner of dust and shadow, a bond had deepened, a moral imperative had been claimed, and the spark of change had begun to burn. Ella exhaled, hand resting lightly against the horse's flank. She could feel its pulse beneath her fingers, strong, steady, patient. And in that heartbeat, she understood the truth she had been circling all along. Sometimes, endurance alone is enough to demand recognition, and sometimes, seeing what others refuse to see is the first act of justice. The question that had lingered since morning, the question of whether she could offer value where others saw none, no longer felt uncertain. She would act. She must act. And whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not leave this corner, would not abandon the horse, would not allow the world's indifference to dictate what deserved to be saved. The auction floor was alive with noise as the late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long, golden rectangles across polished wood and dust. Voices rose and fell in rhythm with the auctioneer's rasping calls, punctuated by the clatter of hooves and the occasional murmur of disbelief. Ella stood at the edge of the main aisle, her hand pressed lightly to the small leather strap of her father's notebook, the one that held their modest bid and their cautious calculations. Her pulse thrummed in tandem with the heartbeat of the barn, steady, measured, determined. She glanced toward the corner where the scruffy horse had been waiting all morning. It shifted slightly, ears forward, nostrils quivering, sensing her presence and the weight of what was to come. Her father's hand found hers, a brief squeeze, a silent question. His face was etched with doubt, worry, and a fatherly caution honed over decades of struggling to keep the ranch solvent. "Ella," he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear, "are you certain? It's not perfect. You know what they'll say." She nodded, letting her fingers curl around his, finding reassurance in the familiar warmth. She understood the risks, the ridicule, the expense, the potential for failure. And yet, she also understood something deeper. Truth was not always measured in appearances or immediate reward. The horse's worth was not in the polished sheen of its coat or the perfection of its gait, but in the resilience it had carried, and in the connection it now offered her. Ella stepped forward, positioning herself closer to the auctioneer's desk. The room seemed to constrict and expand at once, the clamor of bidders fading into a low hum as she inhaled deliberately, drawing in the scents of straw, leather, and sun-warmed hay. She let her eyes meet those of the horse, dark and patient, a silent exchange passing between them. In that instant, she felt the quiet responsibility of advocacy, of moral courage. The horse had endured indifference, neglect, and dismissal. Now, it was her turn to act. She raised her hand, signaling her intention to place a bid, her voice calm but steady. "I'll take him," she said. Simple, unadorned, precise. The auctioneer paused mid-call, eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Are you serious?" he asked, tone equal parts incredulity and mild amusement. Around her, the murmurs began, subtle at first, then rising. "The scraggly one? You can't be serious. Why waste your money?" Ella held her ground, lifting her chin slightly. "I see his value," she said. "He deserves a chance, and I intend to give it to him." Her voice carried a clarity that surprised even her, a firmness rooted in years of quiet observation and careful patience. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some of the ranchers muttered to one another, eyes darting between the scruffy horse and the determined girl at the edge of the aisle. There was a subtle tension now, a tug-of-war between convention and moral clarity. One of the older ranchers, leaning on a cane, whispered to another, "She's got courage. Doesn't mean she's right." Yet even their skepticism carried a grudging acknowledgement. There was something undeniably compelling in her conviction, a strength that demanded notice. The auctioneer adjusted his papers, scanning the sparse notes on the horse's record. Ella watched him carefully, feeling the subtle shift in the air as he read the vet notes and prior ownership records she had uncovered. Injuries long healed, care administered when possible, endurance despite neglect. All facts, yes, but facts with moral weight now, under her persistent gaze. He cleared his throat, tapping the ledger lightly with a slender finger. "Well," he said finally, voice quieter now, "it seems there's merit to your bid after all." A pause hung, thick as dust, before he pronounced, "Sold," to the young lady. The horse shifted, stamping once, then again, nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. Its eyes met hers fully, wide and luminous, reflecting the golden shafts of sunlight. Slowly, it stepped toward her, tentative, deliberate, and then, as if recognizing the conclusion of a long journey, it lowered its head, brushing her shoulder with a gentle nuzzle. Ella felt a shiver of triumph and relief course through her, a wave that carried with it the cumulative weight of months of observation, patience, and moral resolve. The crowd watched silently, some in disbelief, others in quiet respect, as the scruffy horse accepted its advocate without hesitation. Her father exhaled, a breath mingling pride and astonishment. "I thought you might," he began, but Ella shook her head, cutting him off softly. "We did what was right," she said. There was no triumphalism, no need for applause. The satisfaction lay in the silent acknowledgement between girl and horse, the moral victory that required no external validation. She ran a hand along its mane, rough and uneven, feeling the pulse of life and endurance beneath her fingers. The horse had survived neglect. Now, together, they would thrive. Outside the barn, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of amber and pale rose. The golden light fell across the pens and walkways, illuminating the dust in soft halos. Ella led the horse gently toward the gate, her fingers curling around the leather strap of the halter, guiding without force. It moved with cautious trust, ears flicking back toward her, tail swishing lightly. Every step reinforced the bond they had forged, a bond grounded not in ownership, but in recognition and care. Back at the ranch, the horse moved into its new stall, eyes bright, nostrils quivering, tail flicking in tentative excitement. Ella lingered at the doorway, letting her hand rest on the weathered wood as she watched it explore, sniff, and finally settle in. The morning's dust and shadows had been replaced by a calm clarity. She thought of the moral arc of the day, persistence in the face of indifference, patience when recognition seemed impossible, courage when conventional wisdom urged retreat. The horse had endured, and so had she, and together, they had claimed a small but profound victory. Her father joined her at the doorway, eyes softened by a mixture of pride and relief. "You saw what no one else could," he said, voice low, resonant. Ella nodded, feeling the quiet affirmation settle in her chest. There was no boast, no need for grand statements. The truth had prevailed through compassion, through careful attention, through an unwavering refusal to yield to cynicism or convention. That evening, as the sun slipped behind distant hills, Ella led the horse to the pasture. The air was crisp, scented with late autumn grass and the faint tang of nearby creek water. The horse stretched, muscles rippling beneath a coat that, though still uneven, now carried a quiet sheen of care. It lifted its head toward the wind, ears forward, nostrils flaring, as if tasting the freedom and security that had been denied it for so long. Ella stood quietly at its side, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, hair catching the last rays of light, heart steady and filled with a silent, enduring pride. She realized then, with clarity that carried through her bones, that this day had been about more than a bid or a horse. It had been about recognition, the moral courage to see what others would not, the patience to act where others faltered, the resilience to insist upon justice in its quietest, most understated form. In the horse's tentative steps and measured gaze, she saw the embodiment of a truth she had long suspected. Endurance, kindness, and a refusal to yield to indifference could change the course of a life. The barn, the auction, the whispers of doubt. Everything had culminated in this moment of quiet triumph. Ella ran a hand along the horse's flank, feeling its steady pulse beneath her fingers, and knew that the world would continue in its noise and haste. But here, in this pasture, in this golden light, she had witnessed something rare and enduring. The horse, once dismissed, now thrived. She, once unseen, had acted. The bond forged in patience and observation promised to endure far longer than any auctioneer's gavel, far beyond the judgments of the crowd. And as she turned her gaze toward the horizon, the soft glow of the setting sun warming her face, Ella understood the depth of the lesson she had learned. That truth, though resisted, would prevail when met with courage. That power, though tempting, was fleeting beside the quiet force of integrity, and that sometimes the act of recognition itself could be a life-saving victory. The horse nuzzled her shoulder, the last warmth of daylight falling across them both, and she exhaled slowly, a smile faint but certain, knowing the journey had only just begun.